All right, let's begin. Hey, good morning, everyone. I just want to introduce our speaker and our teacher this morning. His name is John Walker. He is the Chief Human Resource Officer at Performance Trust Capital Partners. And so, John, a lot of times I'm going to ask you to say a little bit about yourself personally and also talk about what Capital Partners does. But let me give you guys some information about John as well, too. He's a graduate of the University of Illinois over at Urbana-Champaign. From that point on, he spent some time working at Aon Hewitt Associates. And then from that point on, his life has always been in the HR field over at a company called McMaster Car Supply Company, DeVry Online Services, and now for the last 2 years over at Performance Trust. And so for you, John, I think a lot of times when you were in college, what made you decide to look at the area of human resources? Has that always been what you've majored in? And can you share a little bit about yourself and Capital Partners as well, too? Or Performance?
Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Thank you, Tommy. To answer your question, frankly, when I graduated from college, I had no plans to go into the field of what was then known as personnel management. It really wasn't until I took my first job coming out of college and began working at Allstate insurance companies and realized pretty quickly that the workplace at that time of my life was not terribly engaging. I didn't find it very motivating. I thought there was a pretty big disconnect between the interests of employees and the interests of employers. And that was really what got me interested in going into the field of HR, was I found myself thinking, boy, people spend more time at work than they do with their families, with their spouses, with whatever their interests are outside of work. Can't we create a workplace that is more engaging, fulfilling, that gives people a sense of purpose? And that's really what drew me to the field.
Got it. And so for John, a little bit about yourself. I mean, married, kids?
Sure. We'll jump right into it here. I've got a little bit about me on one of the slides that I'm showing here. So I grew up in a small town in the middle of the state of Illinois, which is sort of the center of the United States. As you mentioned, graduated from the University of Illinois and got my start in HR in 1991 while I was working at a different insurance company here in Chicago called CNA Insurance. I am currently the Chief HR Officer at Performance Trust Capital Partners. I'm married. My wife, Roberta, and I will celebrate our 30th wedding anniversary later this fall. And we have 3 sons, Charles, Andrew, and Edward, sort of like the royal family, to those of you who follow the British monarchy. And I'm very excited to be with you here today to say a little bit about the field that I've dedicated my career to.
Thank you, John. Yeah. Now, for those who may not know, what does Performance Trust does in the area?
So Performance Trust is what is known in the United States as a broker-dealer. And essentially what that means is that we acquire securities. And in the case of our firm, securities are in the form of fixed income securities, or what we call bonds. And we then find a market for those bonds, primarily in banks in the United States, small and mid-sized banks that are required by law to hold a certain amount of their assets in the form of fixed income securities because they are relatively safe, conservative investments. And we are an intermediary between the organizations that issue those bonds and the banks that ultimately buy them. It's been a very successful business, been around for about 25 years. Actually, we'll celebrate our 25th anniversary in March. Founded by 2 gentlemen who graduated from college here in the Chicago area and came up with a methodology for evaluating bonds that proved to be highly successful, easily understood by bankers, and they've made a great business out of it. So about 250 employees, most of them here in Chicago, a small presence in Hong Kong, and a small presence in the area, in a city known as Greenwich, just outside of New York in the state of Connecticut.
Got it. John, before you start your presentation, let me ask one thing. We're going to ask John to spend about 35, 40 minutes doing his presentation and really be able to talk about the subject that we're presenting today. From that point on, we're going to open up for some Q&A in the last 15, 20 minutes. if you guys do have some questions on a Q&A, I actually was wondering if you could put that in your chat column. With so many people on there, we're not going to unmute you all just because it'll cause some confusion and it will just be too disruptive. So if you have questions, send it to me on that, and then from that point, Tommy Lee, and then I will direct that over to John. So John, I'm going to turn that over to you.
Great, very good. Thank you, Tommy. Well, I would be remiss if I didn't begin talking about something that is the topic of conversation amongst anybody who lives in Chicago or its area today, and that is the weather. So if you look at this slide, I put side by side the hour-by-hour forecast for the city of Chicago and the city of Jakarta, and literally today, we will have a 100-degree difference in temperatures between the two cities. It is amongst the coldest days that we have ever had here in Chicago. Our city is somewhat like a ghost town. So if you are complaining about the warmth in Jakarta, trust me that everyone in Chicago would love to be there today because it is bitterly, bitterly cold. In terms of our program today, here's how I would like to spend our time. And as Tommy mentioned, I've tried to build this agenda in a way that will get us through approximately 35 to 40 minutes. So I want to start with just a quick overview of what we hope to accomplish. I then want to jump in very quickly into a little bit of an historical perspective on the field of human resources and how it came to exist in the first place. We'll then look at what I think of as the work of a 21st century human resources department. And let me be very clear here, this is all delivered through the lens of a Western perspective. This would be what a relatively large, relatively sophisticated American organization that houses an HR department would be focused on. I like to keep things practical. I like to give people something that they can take away and actually use in their day-to-day work. And so I've come up with 10 things that if I were you and I were sort of starting from scratch in the area of human resources, that I would do. And so we'll talk about 10 practical steps you can take. I would be remiss if I didn't connect the work of HR and the value of effective management, because the two really are inextricably linked. So I want to talk a little bit about why management matters and how an organization can perhaps drive more effective management. And then, as Tommy said, we'll end our day hopefully with enough time for questions if you have them. So that's what I hope to accomplish. In terms of the objectives, if I were sitting in your chair today listening to this webinar, here is what I would hope that I would come away with at the end of our time together. That you have an understanding of why human resources matters, so the business case, if you will. Understand when we talk about HR, what exactly is the work itself, so the core functions of an HR department. I'd like you to walk away with some steps that you can take to begin building an HR function within your own firms. And then lastly, I want to introduce, and hopefully you will find value in, a very simple framework that you can use for improving the capabilities of your managers within your organizations. So, how did we get here? I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. There's a lot of names on this slide, but suffice to say, this whole notion of human resources and the interaction between an organization's people and its assets, machinery, capital, etc., really began to take shape actually back in prior to 1900. There were a couple of a Brit and a Scotsman, Robert Owen and Charles Babbage, who came at this issue of the connection between work and people very differently. One was a highly analytical guy. Think of him as almost like a 19th century consultant, if you will. The other was a socialist who actually emigrated to the United States and began creating colonies in which a socialist worldview took root because he believed in sort of the power of the workforce, if you will. So two very different perspectives on the same notion of, wow, people really matter when it comes to the success of a business. Jump now into the first half of the 20th century, and you see this explosion of research and science dedicated to this connection between people and work. Here in America, a gentleman by the name of Frederick Taylor pioneered this notion of scientific management. Taylor believed that there was one perfect way to do every job. He broke jobs down into extremely discrete tasks and believed that they could be perfected. His methodology came to be known as scientific management. Later on, a gentleman by the name of C.S. Myers was intrigued by this notion of how individual psychology affects the way people work, and founded an actual organization called the National Institute of Industrial Psychology to study that connection. Guys like Maslow, Herzberg, studied human psychology and sociology and how people's motivation came to bear at work. In the early 1900s, there was a well-known set of studies done actually here in the suburbs of Chicago known as the Hawthorne studies. And the interesting thing about the Hawthorne studies is what it was originally an effort to understand how lighting in a factory would affect people's job performance and productivity. And what they learned from it was, what they found was, when you observe someone working, they work better. Sounds like sort of a really fundamental thing, but to that point, the whole notion of supervising a worker really wasn't on anyone's radar, and it was really brought to bear by the Hawthorne studies. And then finally, in the 1940s, I believe it was 1948, Cornell actually formed the first graduate school program dedicated to this notion of human resources, or industrial and labor relations as it was known at the time. So now we're in the post-war years, the latter half of the 20th century, and we see this incredible set of dynamics of change happening in the United States. It's the post-war years. You have returning veterans coming back from the war. You have an explosion in the population. You have automation and digital technology in its nascent forms beginning to take hold. You had changing nature of the workforce itself. You had more women coming into the workforce, more minorities coming into the workforce. All of these things together, along with the fact that knowledge was becoming the more important aspect of the workforce as opposed to actual physical labor, got organizations to begin realizing that the workforce was an asset in and of itself. In the same way that a person who runs a factory has to keep its machinery running at peak performance in order to be productive and efficient, organizations began to realize they needed their workforce to be managed in the same way, as an asset, as what we call today human capital. And that really is the place that we enter to today. As we look at present day, you see many of the transactional functions that used to be key to the HR department, paying people, administering their benefits, maintaining data. That work, which again was really kind of the fundamentals of personnel management back in the 70s and 80s, is now being handled by outsourced organizations. And the work that is left, the more strategic work, is being done by human resource departments internal to their organizations. CEOs and boards of directors have come to realize that people, a workforce, is a vital component to any organization's success. And so human resources is becoming an increasingly strategic function and unburdening itself of many of the administrative tasks that it used to do. So you see things like employment branding. In the same way that an organization might brand its products, you think of a Volvo car and you instantly think safety, for example. In the same way, companies that say, if someone says, I work at Google, there's usually an image that comes immediately to mind of what a Google employee looks like. If someone says they work at Amazon, there is a reputation or an image or a set of attributes that comes immediately to mind. Amazon, same sort of thing. And HR is increasingly involved in helping build those employment brands. The world in which we operate today is also increasingly complex from a legal standpoint. So the area of employment law is one that people have actually begun to specialize here in the United States. And then the last thing I'll just say about this is that there was a time and place when the field of human resources was thought of as almost an exit ramp for someone's career, a place where people were sort of put out to pasture and left to their own devices where they couldn't do any harm. And increasingly what we're finding today is that HR is drawing people who begin their careers in business, like I did, who understand the fundamentals of business, because it's so critical to have that understanding of the business first so that you can then understand the human or people implications of the business. So that's kind of what the state of HR is today, again, in 21st century America. This diagram that I've put on the screen here is really intended to display this shift. Whereas in the past you saw a personnel or human resources department that was heavily focused on administrative work, keeping records, shuffling paper, paying people, getting them enrolled in their benefits, etc. We've almost flipped that on its head today. That work today is oftentimes done by third parties that aren't even employed by the organization. And instead, what you see is smaller HR departments doing much more strategic work and consultative work with their business leaders. So when we talk about human resources, what exactly is it that we mean by that? What is the work of human resources? I've got a couple of diagrams here that I would use to illustrate that. So on this diagram, the blue wedges that you see here represent what are traditionally thought of as the pillars or the sub-disciplines or the functions that form a human resources department. And I believe there are 7 of them. And in a moment here, we'll drill down into each of these and I can show you exactly what kind of work exists in each of these pie slices, if you will. But before we do that, I want to call your attention to the pink circle that surrounds this entire set of wedges here. That really represents the environment in which a business operates. And so you can see on the left-hand side here, things like legal issues that might be specific to a country, a state, a municipality. There's always a social element that influences the work of HR. Political influences have a lot to do with the way we think about managing our workforce. Certainly cultural elements, etc. So the way I like to think about this is in any relatively large, relatively sophisticated organization, you will find some form of the work that is represented inside that circle being done. But how that work gets done is heavily influenced by what is outside of the organization and exerting influence on it. Let me illustrate, if I could, with an example. All organizations have to figure out a way to pay people such that you can attract and retain the employees that you need in order to meet your business objectives. But if you were to take 2 organizations, let's say one, for example, is a poultry producer in the southern part of the United States, and the other is a high-tech organization based in the San Francisco Bay Area that produces satellites, for example. Both of them are going to have an approach to managing employee and labor relations. Both of them are going to have an element of rewards and compensating people appropriately. Both of them are going to have issues with risk management and worker protection. But the specifics of those programs and how they get managed are going to be heavily influenced by those things that I mentioned a moment ago. The legal environment, the laws in California that govern a primarily white-collar workforce are very different than those in the southern part of the United States where you would have a primarily blue-collar workforce, for example. The labor markets just in terms of unemployment rates and compensation demand, et cetera, very different. So same work done in a very different context. So if we drill down a little bit further, here you see on the next slide the exact same elements that were represented on the previous page, broken down into some bullets that explain exactly what we mean when we talk about equal employment, or talent acquisition, or talent management. I won't walk you through all of these, but I really wanted to show these just as examples of, so when we say things like, oh, our company has a person who's in charge of talent acquisition. Well, what exactly is it that they do? As you see on the slide here, making sure that you have both the right number of people, but also the people with the right set of skills in order for the business to meet its demands. It's articulating the duties and qualifications for positions. That's part of talent acquisition as well. You can't hire someone if you don't know exactly what it is that you're trying to hire, for example. And then you have to evaluate candidates as they come in the door to be considered for jobs. How will you assess them? You need to do that here in the United States anyway, in a systemic way that eliminates bias from the process to the greatest degree possible. So that also is part of the work of someone who would work in the talent acquisition function. So again, I won't drill down through each one of these, but when you hear me talk about, or when you hear another senior HR person talk about the work of HR, generally speaking, these are the types of things that they are talking about. So as I said at the outset of our time together here, I like to try to keep things very practical. So as I was preparing for today's session, I thought to myself, if I were starting a company from scratch and decided at some point that I needed a human resource function, or I needed to inject into the organization some element of human resource management, where would I start? What would be the things that I would say would be most important? And here's what I came up with. So I call this 10 things I recommend. So if you are a small business leader who is just growing to the point where you're starting to feel the need for some HR management, or you are a large organization that is beginning to establish its own HR function, here are the things that I would say to start with. And I want to warn you, some of this will come across as probably really basic, but it is remarkable to me that even in this day and age, how many organizations just simply don't do kind of the very fundamental things that we sort of take for granted in larger companies. So the first one would be, if you're going to hire somebody, start by defining the job. It's really difficult to match a potential employee to your organization if you can't articulate first what it is they are going to do and the skills that they need in order to be able to do that. In the United States here, we typically refer to that as a job description or a job specification. And many people think of it as an administrative exercise, but I can tell you, it in many ways forms the foundation of your workforce, is being clear about just exactly what it is people are going to do. Second thing, I sort of alluded to this in my introductory comments. Managers are the linchpin in any organization. I like to think of them almost as a multiplier, so, or a divisor, depending on the caliber of the person. In my company of 250 people, now it's relatively small by US standards, I can't know everyone. Our CEO can't know everyone. And when I say know them, they may know them by name, they may know them by appearance, but they can't know them in the way that a manager who is working with them on an everyday basis knows them. Managers are that linchpin that either multiplies the effect of the people underneath them by motivating them, coaching them, developing them, or they diminish the output of the people who work for them by doing the opposite of the things that effective managers do. And in a few moments here, we're going to talk about what we believe good management looks like and some things that you can do as an organization to try to build that. But I would just tell you, as you start to think about the people who you are going to give the privilege of managing others to, choose them wisely and find a way to evaluate how well they are doing that part of their job on a continuous basis. The third thing I would offer as advice is, when you are hiring, know the difference and make a conscious decision of when you are hiring for potential versus hiring for performance. What do I mean by that? There are certain jobs that are always going to exist in a given organization. And it is likely that the people who are hired into those jobs might have a specific set of skills, talents, a specific labor that they bring to your organization. And that might be all that they ever do for the entirety of the time that they work for you. In that case, hire for performance. You want someone in that job who can do that job and that job alone as well as possible. You know, in a very simple world, for example, if you need someone to pick orders from a warehouse who has an extremely high level of attention to detail and the ability to move quickly and who's physically fit, etc., then hire for that. If, on the other hand, you're bringing talent into the organization to do a particular task, job, set of duties, with the idea being that they are going to grow and expand their responsibilities over time, then I would tell you, I would get less hung up about how well they can do the job that they are hired to do today and be more concerned about what their ceiling is in the long term, hiring people who have the potential to grow within your organization and eventually lead others, for example. Many organizations face financial challenges and limited financial resources. And so what I would offer is this: if you're in an organization that has limited financial resources when it comes to your ability to manage your workforce, first and foremost, safe working conditions. Some of the research that I referred to earlier in the deck, Abraham Maslow, for example, talked about the need for safety and security being a fundamental thing in people's hierarchy of needs. Same thing goes with the workforce. People expect reasonable, safe working conditions, and if you can't provide that, that's sort of the stakes that get you to the table, if you will. This next one says, pay the lowest wages needed to retain talent, and people read that and go, wow, that seems so draconian. But I would just tell you, research has said time and time again, wages are not the thing that motivate people to do their best work. What motivates them to do their best work is to feel as though their employer has regard for them, that they are doing work that connects what they do each day to the purpose of the bigger organization, etc. Which leads me to the third bullet: invest heavily in those things that drive engagement. So if you've got limited dollars to spend the money you need to get the right people in the door, and only that amount of money, but then make sure that they are well cared for, that your managers are trained well to connect their work to the bigger purpose of the organization, that they feel as though they are heard by the organization, etc. In the United States, many organizations create what is known as an employee handbook or a policy manual, and this has really evolved from the notion of legal compliance. Organizations don't want to ever be accused of treating people differently on the basis of some personal characteristic, whether that is their race, their age, their gender, etc. So many organizations create very large, very detailed manuals that say, here's all the rules by which we operate our company and by which you have to agree to live and work each day. And what I would tell you is, where it is important to have consistency, if it's either required or desired, by all means, have policies. But be careful of the trap that you fall into, because once policies are created, they become the rules that you have to live by, and you lose a lot of flexibility as an organization to really react and make decisions based on the unique circumstances for each individual or each situation. So the way I like to say this is, there's times when you manage by policy, and there are times when you manage by principle. Some level of policy is required in almost every organization today, but it's really when you manage by principle that people find out what your organization is really about. Are you willing to make the right decision for the right reasons, for the right person at the right time? There's this concept of an employee value proposition. So the way I like to think of it is, if a person who is considering coming to work for your company were to ask the question, why should I come work for you? Your answer to that is really the definition of your employee value proposition. So what many organizations do, and what I encourage organizations to do, is to answer that question up front. Why would someone want to come work here? Is it because they're going to be paid the top of the range wages? Is it because they will have tremendous career advancement opportunities? Is it because they will learn something that they would never have the opportunity to learn at another place? Is it because they'll be surrounded by like-minded people who have similar values, similar interests? Whatever the answer might be, and there's no right or wrong answer, whatever you decide that thing is, you then need to make sure that what people experience when they come in the door and begin working for your company matches up to that. Because if it doesn't, you don't really have an employment brand. If, for example, I were to interview a candidate and say to them, the reason you want to come to work for Performance Trust is because you are going to have a greater opportunity to learn, grow, and develop here than you would at any other organization that does what we do. And they then come to work and find out can't get into a training class, no one's willing to take the time to meet with them to mentor them, there's no organized on-the-job training for them. It's a complete mismatch, and that's when you lose people, good people. Same thing, if I tell someone, hey, this is a place where you can have a nice work-life balance, do good work, but also go home and go to your family at the end of the day on time, and they come in the door and they find out that they're working 60 or 80 hours a week, again, the disconnect. So I would encourage you, be declarative about that. What will you stand for as an employer, and how will you build the systems that support that? This next one may feel a little bit harsh, but I would tell you, when it comes to new employees, fail fast. What I mean by that is you have to think of your workforce as an investment. And to the degree that you are pouring time and resources, and in some cases money, into someone that is not ultimately going to generate a return on the investment that you are making in them, the longer you prolong that relationship, all you are doing is just taking on a diminishing return. So I would encourage you to have a way to think thoughtfully and systemically about what will tell you 30, 60, 90 days into someone's employment whether or not they are hitting the marks that they need to hit that demonstrate that they are being successful for your organization, and be willing to end the relationship if it's just simply not working. The other thing that I would tell you when it comes to hiring, we talked at the very beginning about setting or describing the job in a detailed way. Part of defining the job also involves knowing how are you going to evaluate whether someone has been successful in the position. It is remarkable to me how many times I see people brought into an organization and people know exactly what they're looking for. They've said, I need this many years of experience with this skills and these computer languages, etc. And they get the person here, and 3, 6, 9 months down the road, I'm talking with a manager who's concerned about the performance of a new hire, and I will ask them, well, how are you evaluating them? What is it that you are asking them to do that tells you that they are either being successful or not? And they can't answer that question. So before you bring someone on board, make sure that you know what is going to be to tell you whether or not they have ultimately been successful. The research shows us time and time again that new employees are most vulnerable during their first 100 days with an organization. And a huge influencer of that is how well they are brought into the organization. So on the first day that an employee shows up, they have a desk or a workspace. Is the workspace appropriately equipped? Do they get introduced to the people around them so that they don't feel like the new kid in the classroom who nobody knows? Do they understand the basics of the company and have some sort of a grounding of what the organization does? All of those things contribute to the impression that someone is forming during that first 100 days. Most organizations today would tell you that the onboarding process actually starts well before the person starts. Here at Performance Trust, for example, we are in communication with our candidates beginning roughly 30 to 40 days before they come on board. We enroll them in their benefits. We provide them materials for them to get oriented to the company. All of those things that help them feel as though we are looking out for their well-being when they come on board. And then I believe this is the last one. A little bit of a philosophical message here, but many organizations think of their employees as children and the management as the parents. And I will just tell you that, especially amongst younger employees, that relationship just doesn't work for them. Your employees are adults, and sometimes that requires us to tell people things that they may not want to hear, but it's necessary. It's a difficult message that just simply needs to be said. And I would just encourage you, we use the phrase around here a lot, adult conversations, treating people, peers and subordinates, like adults, and addressing the things that are difficult to address, but that's what adults do. They get in a room and they talk about the issues when they have them. So again, that was intended to be sort of 10 things that if I were you, I would say I could perhaps even start doing as soon as tomorrow. The next thing I wanted to talk about was management and its importance in an organization. So I just want to share a couple of snippets here for some research. Harvard Business Review, two researchers, I believe, from MIT did a really interesting study about the value of management and why management matters. And you can see here on the screen a summary of their results. A second study that was done by Google, they did a project back in 2012, 2013 called Project Oxygen. Google, when it was founded, Larry Page and Sergey Brin wanted no managers. They literally did not want to have managers at the organization. As they grew, it became a necessary evil, but management was really never embraced at Google. So they asked their quantitative researchers to study, does management matter? And the overwhelming answer was yes. Their quantitative research showed the best managers, time and time again, had the best performing teams. And they actually came up with a set of behaviors that tie to effective management. So if you are a good manager at Google, these are the things that you do. And again, this was shown through quantitative research to be highly correlated with team performance. I won't walk you through the whole list, but here again, I would say these are things that any manager could begin asking themselves today. Do I do these things? If you're not doing all of these things or you're not doing them well, chances are you're not getting the most out of your people. Here at Performance Trust, we understood early on the importance of management. And like any other job, we realized the important thing was to set clear expectations. If we said we wanted people to be good at management, we needed to be able to tell them this is what success looks like as a manager. So we came up with this very simple model. There are 4 expectations that we have of managers, and these are shown in the lavender boxes here. And there are a set of competencies or attributes that we think enable someone to be able to do those 4 things well. Now, underneath each one of those 4, drive high performance, represent the interests of the firm, etc., there is a lengthy set of behaviors that demonstrate what it means to do that. So this is the what, and then beneath this we give them the how. Again, this may not work for your organization, but I think it's important that you define for your managers just exactly what it is you expect them to be doing every day. I'm going to close then with just one very simple model, because this whole concept of management can get very, very complex. And I would tell you, if you take nothing else away from today's presentation, if you go back tomorrow and talk to the managers at your plant or your office building, consider the following. At the end of the day, management is a series of conversations between employees and their manager. Those conversations, generally speaking, should be answering one of 6 questions that every employee has at some point during their time with your organization. So my advice to you would be, ask your managers if an employee came to them today and asked one of these questions, would they be able to answer it? And if the answer is no, help them answer it. So those questions are very simple. What's expected of me? Every employee needs to have clear expectations of what success looks like in their job. How am I doing? So you told me what you expect of me. Am I doing what you asked of me? How did I do? Now you might hear that and say, well, you just asked that question. The how did I do conversation is really about a retrospective over a period of time, usually a year, where somebody is saying, hey, you're doing fine today, much better than you were a year ago. Or a year ago you were doing pretty well, but boy, things have really changed since then. So this is really about a retrospective look at performance. How will I be rewarded? It's called work for a reason. People, generally speaking, take employment in order to earn a wage, and they want to understand how their work leads to whatever compensation they are receiving. What should I develop? Are there things that I need to work on to get better at my current job or to open doors for me into other jobs in the future? And then lastly, what's next for me? I'm doing this job today. Is there any prospect for me doing something bigger or better at some point in the future? So again, a very simple framework created by a guy by the name of Steve King, former head of HR at Aon Hewitt, that we teach our managers here, and I would encourage you to take back to your organizations. So, Tommy, that concludes the content that I have. I think we wrapped that in just about 40 minutes, and I am open to any questions that people may have.
Hey, you are wonderful, John. Hey, let me ask you a couple questions that people have been sending over to me. When you talk about some of the 6 indicators, for you, what are some of the key performance indicators that you tend to measure people with? What are some of the things that you would recommend?
So it's going to differ tremendously on the based on the organization and the nature of the job. So I'll give you a couple of examples from my real life examples for me, okay? I worked for a company called McMaster Carr, and they operated enormous warehouses where they had people that were called bin fillers. And what a bin filler did was they literally went every day to 10,000 different locations inside a massive rack of shelves and pulled items from a box to fill orders. 10,000 orders a day these people would fill. They would walk an average of 13 to 14 miles every day. For that job, the things that you would measure were really, really simple. It was accuracy and it was speed. How many errors did they make relative to the number of orders they filled, and how many orders did they fill relative to the amount of time that they were working? Very straightforward, very simple job. You knew exactly whether or not you were doing well or doing poorly on that job based on those 2 metrics. Compare that with a bond trader at Performance Trust. So bonds are, the price of a bond is based on the market. So you as a bond trader don't always have a great deal of influence over what you end up paying for a particular bond to acquire it. But if you're good at your job, you can recognize values where a bond has been, for some reason or another, discounted, acquire that bond, and then have it sold at a higher price, creating a greater spread. It's a much, much more sophisticated, much more analytically based job, but at the end of the day, it's also very measurable. You know what you paid for something, you know what we were able to sell it for, and the difference is really an indicator of how well you did your job. The more margin you create, the better you are at your job. So again, I would say when possible, make the metrics or the measurements of performance either measurable and quantitative or observable. Not everything is measurable, but most things are observable.
Got it. Hey, John, let me ask you a quick question as a follow-up with this one. Number one, how often do you recommend really evaluating your employees? How often do you recommend evaluating your managers? And also, I think a lot of times, especially for an employee or manager that is underperforming, how fast do you cut them? You talked about fail fast. How fast do you cut them? Or when do you start investing in them knowing that they have potential? What's that responsibility that you have? Sorry, multiple questions on that front, John.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So I'm sorry, Tommy, could you hit the first couple pieces of it? Because I heard evaluating managers, but what was the first part of it?
How often would you recommend evaluating managers versus evaluating employees?
Right. So there's a trend, at least in the United States. It used to be that organizations did performance reviews once a year. People hated them. It was like a report card. You went in and you got well, here's how you did this year. And what organizations are evolving toward now is far more frequent, but far less formal performance evaluations. We here at Performance Trust do them quarterly, but we don't make people do this enormous paper exercise. It's literally a checkbox where the person is either below, at, or above expectations with some commentary. And by the way, we allow the employee to evaluate themselves, and we allow the manager to evaluate, and then the two sit down and compare notes. So we do that on a continuous basis quarterly, and I would say the more often you are doing it and more regularly, the better. So that was the first part. In terms of managers, this is a really tough one. What I would tell you is there is when someone becomes a new manager, it is oftentimes a very difficult transition to make from being an individual contributor, you're only responsible for your own work, to managing the work of others. So I think personally that you need at least a year in order to be able to get your sea legs under you and feel like you know what you're doing as a manager. So I would probably not even begin to be worried about a manager until at least their 1-year anniversary in the job, at which point you can look back and say, are there people thriving? Is the department performing well? Have things gotten better since the manager came on board? And the how you do this for managers is very tricky. And here's what I mean by that. Suppose, for example, that you were hearing lots of concerns or complaints about the employees who work for a particular manager, and you're thinking to yourself, wow, this manager must be really harsh, must be really tough. I'm not sure they're really all that good at their job. But if you look back and you find a department that was underperforming for some period of time, or had a previous manager who did not hold people accountable, and now you have a manager who's coming in and actually doing the right things, but is creating some disruption for the workforce, you have to be careful not to punish the manager for doing what ultimately might be the thing that is in the best interest of the organization. We dealt with this in a department here where we had a manager who is no longer with our organization. Her people loved her. They thought the world of it. Well, the reason they loved her was because essentially she would let them get away with anything. They were coming and going whenever they wanted. The work wasn't getting done on time. They had poor relationships with other departments. We removed her from the role. We brought someone in from a different part of the organization, and it was tough. The first year, lots of friction, lots of pushing back. Now, a year later, she started to form the team that she wants, and you're starting to see the team perform better as a result of sort of her instilling a new set of expectations and a new culture.
John, thank you very much. Hey, here is another one that someone wrote, and I couldn't remember exactly how you phrased it. You talked about low wages in concept. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of maximizing your money, your revenue? It was early in the slide.
Yep. I believe it was this one. So essentially what I'm saying is if I have a limited amount of money to spend, the place that I'm going to spend it is it's not on wages. I'm not going to pay top of market wages in order, if I have a limited amount of financial resources available to me. I have to pay people whatever I have to pay them in order to attract the talent I need. But if I have a limited pool of dollars to pull from, I'm not going to pay above market wages because frankly, that's not what's going to get the best out of your people. the fact that you pay them marginally more, I think you would be wise, if you have limited discretionary dollars, to spend it in those places that are going to affect them in ways that perhaps play to their hearts and minds a little bit more than it does to their paycheck. Real quick research here. I mentioned earlier in the program, I mentioned a researcher by the name of Kurzberg, Frederick Kurzberg. He came up with this idea of motivators and hygiene factors, kind of an odd terminology. Hygiene factors were sort of like hey, look, I'm not going to take a job where I go into work every day and don't feel safe. Safety is a hygiene factor, okay? I'm not going to go and take a job where I don't have the equipment that's necessary in order to be able to do my work. It's a hygiene factor. They are the things that just the minimal expectations that you have to meet. Pay is a hygiene factor. It's not a motivator. Motivators are things that people experience when they are on the job. The relationships they have with their coworker, the alignment of their personal values to the values of the organization, the working for a manager who has regard for their personal circumstances. That is where I would invest if I had limited dollars available. You got to pay people. You got to pay them enough to get them to come, but don't expect that you're going to get their best just by paying them more. Hopefully that answers your question.
It does. John, we actually have a whole bunch of questions. I know that we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try to go quickly, but we actually may need to drill down some and bring you back one day soon. But here's one question. Is it important for an HR professional or HR person like yourself to have your CEO and your management team on board with your policies in establishing a culture? Or is it the role of HR just to establish that and it's okay if, and not totally get their buy-off on it? Does that make sense?
Question makes perfect sense, and I would say there's almost two different answers here. So I do not know a single senior HR leader who has ever been successful driving their agenda without the support of their CEO. So if you as an HR professional believe that the organization needs to move in a particular direction, culturally, philosophically, principle-wise, I would begin that conversation with your CEO. I wouldn't wait to have it. Because frankly, if your CEO and the senior leadership is not bought in, I just think you're dead in the water. However, that is different than policy. So my CEO will often come to me and ask me questions like, what are the best organizations doing when it comes to tuition reimbursement? What are the best organizations doing when it comes to educating people about harassment in the workplace? What are the best organizations doing about student loan forgiveness? Those areas where there's like almost like an element of technical expertise, your CEO is going to lean into you because you're supposed to be the expert. And there, I think good CEOs want to be educated. They don't know everything, but you need to base your advice to them on data. It can't be, well, here's what I think. It should be, here's what the market tells us and why I think this is the right direction for us to go. So you see the difference between sort of the binary stuff, a policy about X, Y, or Z, versus the philosophical stuff, which I would call, what kind of an organization do we want to be?
Got it. These days, John, a lot of people are attracted to the Google type of culture where flexible hours, you get to play ping pong all day and arcades all day. How do you determine which culture fits you, or how to develop that culture where there's a lot of structure or there's no structure? How do you determine what's best for your organization as an HR professional as you look at that culture of the organization?
So first of all, I'm going to tell you I'm very cynical in general, I'm cynical, but I am extremely cynical when it comes to the kind of stuff that you're referring to here. And what do I mean by that? If you've been following the news at all, you know that Google has had more than its share of workplace issues. For crying out loud, they had a walkout worldwide here just within the last 6 months of their non-unionized workforce worldwide. So all the ping pong tables and the napping pods and the on-site sushi and all that other stuff, that's great. But at the end of the day, people want to be treated well, and they want to feel like they matter, and they want to feel like their work is aligned to the values of the organization. And I think Google's really wrestling with the disconnect there. By the way, there's an article in the paper today, an internal memo got leaked where Google was lobbying for a change to the National Labor Relations regulations about employees being allowed to use their email to organize. And Google wants that to go away, and their employees are probably not going to have a terribly good reaction to that. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox about Google now. I also believe, and again, I think I'm in the minority here, people talk a lot about cultural change in organizations, and it is my belief that you can nibble around the edges and you can make gradual shifts over time, but dramatic, really truly breakthrough change requires cataclysmic events. It requires a change in your CEO. It requires a merger and acquisition. It requires a failure of such scale that you are required to do some real introspection about your organization. So I don't want to be a naysayer here, but I have been parts of culture change initiatives at multiple organizations, including one that spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in an effort to shape the culture, and none of them ultimately worked. Cultures are living organisms. They're people. They're formed by the people that live within the society or culture or subgroup. And I am just not a big fan of putting a lot of stake in the idea of we are going to consciously drive culture change.
Got it.
That's how I feel.
Got it. John, there's two, but I'm going to ask you one quick question. In the future, they want to talk a little bit more about employee retention and best hiring practices, but I'm going to actually end you with employee, in Indonesia, a lot of times, a lot of the bigger companies are stealing a lot of good employees from startups. And a lot of times the startups are dealing with employees that aren't very good, or they're hiring cheaper employees and developing them. But once they're developed and identified, then the bigger companies come and steal them. What are some of your best practices or recommendations for employee retainment?
That's a great question, and I find that fascinating. It's actually the opposite here in the United States, where you have large organizations investing very heavily in people, and the startups are the ones poaching them away. And what people are drawn to in the startup environment is oftentimes the ability to get in on the ground floor and share in the success of the organization. So obviously details matter about a particular organization, but if I were in a situation like that, I would be telling my head of HR, you need to come up with a long-term incentive plan to retain at least the key people that that are crucial to our development efforts. So there are ways, for example, we're exploring a program right now, haven't put it in place yet. It's called a profits interest program, where you pick a point in time, you say, January 1st, 2019, our organization is worth $100 million. And we need people to stay with us until we launch our product. And that's going to be 2 years down the road. And so on January 1st, 2021, we expect to be worth $200 million. Well, guess what? You 50 employees who are really, really important to us, I'm going to take a percentage of that gain and I'm going to give it to you if we hit that target 2 years down the road, so that they know that there's this enormous upside for them if they stick around, provided that the organization is successful. It kind of funds itself. There's no additional cost. You're basically saying, if we make it, I'm going to make it really successful for you personally. That's what I would probably do.
Got it. John, we've taken up a lot of your time. Hey, thank you so much. We're going to have you back if you have time. But hey, thank you so much, John, and everyone, thank you for everything. Any last words, John?
I will just tell you, I mean, I really enjoyed doing this, and I put my email up here. I think it's on the last slide. I mean what I'm about to say here. If you have feedback for me as to whether or not this was helpful or something that you would have liked to have heard that was different than what I talked about, please let me know that. I really enjoyed this and I greatly appreciate the opportunity, but this is the first time I've ever dealt with an audience from Indonesia. I have no idea whether or not this was close to the mark or far off, so tell me. And I appreciate everything that you've done, Tommy, and thank you for your time.
You got it. Hey, everyone, we are going to have another one in 2 months, and so we'll send you more information on that. That one will deal with conflict, how employers work with conflict in the office, how they actually deal with conflict with employees. So we're going to do that in 2 months. And John and everyone, have a good night in Indonesia, and John, have a good day at the office.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.